Welcome back. This is Lecture 6 on the elements of music, and this lecture is all about harmony, which personally I find to be maybe the most interesting, most mysterious of all the elements of music that we're going to talk about. I should start by saying I'm not totally happy with the definition that the book gives. We'll use it for the sake of, like if there's a question on the test, go ahead and remember this definition, but then I'll discuss why it's problematic. It says, harmony refers to the way chords are constructed and how they follow each other. Well, that's not really what it is, because you can have harmony without chords. In fact, that's how harmony evolved. It wasn't that someone invented chords and then started creating chord progressions, and that's how harmony was born. Harmony arose from the desire to match one melodic line with another one, or to have simultaneous melodic lines going on. In fact, anytime you have two or more different tones sounding at the same time, you have harmony. Harmony refers to the organization of simultaneous different tones. That's how I would have defined it. I can sort of understand why they defined it this way, but it's not really the best definition. Here's another problem with it. The next thing they do is they define chords, which is a good thing, because they say harmony refers to the way chords are constructed and how they follow each other. Then it says a chord is a combination of three or more tones sounded at once. And that is true. Technically, you have to have a minimum of three tones sounding at once to have a chord. The simplest type of chord, as we will learn very soon, is called a triad. It has three different tones. However, you can have harmony with only two tones sounding at the same time. In fact, you've probably heard people, someone starts singing a melody and then someone will join in and harmonize, and they will usually follow in at some kind of regular distance away, maybe the interval of a third or a sixth, which we happen to like. But there's only two different tones sounding at a time. Yet it's still harmony. You would say, "Oh, I'm harmonizing," with this melody. So again, you don't need three tones to have harmony. You don't need chords. You don't need to be thinking in terms of chords. A chord is a combination of three tones sounded at once. We tend to think of chords as like vertical structures, right? Again, that's a spatial thing, but we can't help it. The way they're written is even vertical, whereas we think of melodies as sort of like horizontal structures. And long before anyone really came up with the idea of a triad, or this sort of vocabulary of chords that has evolved over time in Western music, people were harmonizing, right? So, be that as it may, the next term that they define is a progression. A progression is simply a logical sequence of chords. When composers use chords, they tend to use them in some kind of a more or less logical sequence. And this is, again, one of these areas where music is sort of similar to language, in that there are certain sequences of chords in Western music that are considered logical, maybe because we've heard them so many times, we're just kind of accustomed to them. They sound logical, they sound at least somewhat predictable, and retroactively, as we hear one chord and say, oh, okay, that makes sense coming from this other chord, etc. And then there are other sequences of chords that don't seem logical. And again, this is one of these things that I would teach in a music theory course. Which sequences of chords are logical, that is characteristic of the Western style, and which are not. Before we get too much farther into this, I want to talk a little bit about where our current system of harmony came from. Now, there's not one system of harmony, but there is one that is prevalent that you will hear in just about any popular form of music and a great deal of quote unquote classical music as well. And that is something called the tonal harmonic system. It's also sometimes called common practice tonal harmony. It's called tonal because the idea is a composer chooses one particular tone, and that is sort of like the most important tone out of the set of tones he will use. It's sort of like the center of gravity, harmonically speaking, melodically speaking, for the composition. And in fact, this is what we're talking about when we say that a piece is in the key of C or in the key of G. G or C or whatever tone the composer chooses is the tonal center. Right? That's not the way it has always been, however. Tonal harmony evolved beginning around 500 or 600 years ago from an older system called modal harmony. And modal, or let's say a modal system, whether or not there is harmony, it is modal but not necessarily tonal. What do I mean by that? What is a mode? A mode is simply a scale. It's just another word for scale. Usually when musicians or music professors such as myself talk about modes versus scales, we might be talking about the modes that the ancient Greeks used, which we know about because they wrote about them. You know, I mentioned in an earlier lecture, we don't know an awful lot about what ancient music actually sounded like, but we know how, especially the Greeks, how they thought about music, how they conceived of music, because they wrote a lot about it, and we know even some of the scales that they used. Anyway, we might also we might use the distinction of modes to talk about certain scales that were used in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, that might not be used so much anymore. Jazz musicians also talk about modes because they use some of those modes that were used more in the Renaissance and the medieval, and there's also some other additional modes that they use. So the word mode versus scale, it's just kind of like a question of context, but there are two modes or scales in particular that in Western tonal music, that is in music from about the 1500s or so up to the present day, and certainly in popular music, not so much necessarily in classical music of the 20th century, because when we get into the 20th century, composers started to feel like these conventional scales, the major and minor scale, these are the two that I'm talking about that are prevalent in tonal music, in common practice tonal music. Composers in the 20th century started to feel like anything that could have been said in this system, using this quote-unquote language, had already been said, and they were searching for new and original materials, new ways of organizing tones that were not tonal, or even necessarily conventionally modal. That is, composers began to reject the idea that there should be one tone that is the most important tone, that we should be writing music in a key. They started writing music that was atonal. At the same time, they also started to, many of them, reject the major and minor scale. They said, it's tired, it's old, it's been done to death, I want to do something new and original. Right? So in the 20th century, many composers rejected this. In the process of doing that, by the way, they alienated their audiences because audiences coming to hear a concert were used to this system, which had been around for hundreds of years. And they heard this new music, and a lot of it sounded just like random notes, like a cat walking across the keyboard, or the sound of an orchestra warming up rather than playing a composition. And as a result of that, I think there's been, certainly in the last maybe 30 or 40 years, a movement back towards more tonal music. Right? So the situation in the 20th century is very kind of mixed up. You have all different composers doing different things, composers inventing their own new, more or less, language, their new way of organizing tones, which might even be sort of like unique to them and might not even catch on with anybody else. Right? There are other composers who continue to compose in the old way, in the old tonal harmonic style, using scales, using a tonal center. Those composers were very often criticized by the intellectuals of the day, by the music critics, of being out of touch, old-fashioned. Right? Maybe the best example of this is one of my favorite composers, Rachmaninoff. Meanwhile, movie music has more or less remained tonal. And maybe this is because, movies have to be popular. You can't really afford to alienate your audience in the way that some avant-garde classical composers of the 20th century did. So when you go to a movie, maybe you expect to hear, you expect to not be sort of like taken out of it or disturbed or had this kind of jarring sense that the music just, isn't communicating to you in the way that you are used to. It doesn't complement the movie somehow. So, for example, the music of John Williams, very much tonal. It uses this tonal harmonic system. Okay, so that was kind of a lot of explanation for kind of like setting the background for what the tonal harmonic system, that is, when was it used, when is it not used anymore, who is using it. Anyway, so we have this modal system, a system built on scales that comes from the ancient Greeks through the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. And in this idea, there are several different scales the composer can choose from. Right? As we move into the tonal era, it's almost as if sort of like by a process of natural selection, two scales in particular, two of those modes win out over the others. And the others kind of more or less kind of die out. They aren't used as much. The two that win out are what we today call the major scale and the minor scale. And instead of having many different modes to choose from that always begin and end on a particular note, we have only two scales, but we can choose to have them begin or end on whichever note we choose. Now, this in part depends on whether the instruments are capable of playing in a certain key or not. But instead of having, for example, something called the Phrygian mode. The Phrygian mode in the old system always begins on E. It's sort of like all of the white keys on the piano going from E to E. Okay, and the thing is, it's always from E to E. It isn't transposed to other keys, at least not under the old system of modal harmony. In the new system of tonal harmony, we have only two scales, but the idea is we can transpose them, play them on any key. Any one of the notes that is available to us could be our key center. So we combine the idea of scales, but only these two, the major scale and the minor scale, which under the old system were known as the Ionian mode, which is the major scale, and the Aeolian mode, which was the minor scale. So we're limiting ourselves really to only two scales, but we can have any tonal center we want. We could have the C major scale or the D major scale or the E flat major scale. We could have the A minor scale, which is Aeolian mode, or we could have an F minor scale. We could have a B minor scale. Right? In addition to this, within a composition, we might not stay in that same key or the same mode for the entire time. In the older style, if a composer began a piece, let's say in the medieval, in the Renaissance, if they began in a certain mode, like Phrygian mode, they would stay in that mode for the entire work, or the entire, let's say, movement of a work. Right? And that meant you are only likely to hear 7 different pitches. I mean, maybe some of them an octave higher or lower, but so you're limiting yourself to the number of pitches that you can have. But using the tonal system, if we decide to change mode or change key within a piece, then it's almost like we're like exploring different regions, and this is how composers think of different key centers. And in a fairly large composition, a composer might change key many times throughout the work. Right? Might go from C major to G major, and then to E minor, and eventually back to the key they started out from. So there's a possibility of greater variety of pitches, and the possibility of what we call modulation, that is, moving from one key center to another. There's also the possibility of change of mode, going from the major mode to the minor mode, and maybe back again to the major mode. Anyway, I'm kind of like throwing a lot of stuff at you. We'll come back over some of those terms in case that was a bit confusing. We'll backtrack and we'll come back to some of those concepts that I just kind of laid out. Again, harmony is so complex that it's difficult to even talk about it without starting to explain or define something and then having to backtrack and define some of the terms you used. It's difficult to pick one particular starting point. But what the book does, it starts out with this concept of consonance and dissonance. And that's a good place to start. So consonance simply means, con means together, and sonance has to do with sound, right? Son, S-O-N, like sonar or sonic. Consonance refers to two or more different tones that blend well together, right? When we have two or more different tones sounding simultaneously and the effect, it seems that they blend well together, we call that consonance. The opposite of that is dissonance, right? When we have a combination of two or more tones that sounds sort of clashing or jarring or tense or unsettled. Right? Now, you might think, well, isn't that kind of a subjective thing? Like what sounds consonant, what sounds like it blends well to you might sound dissonant to me. Yes and no. Mostly no. What makes a sound consonant is a function of the ratios. Remember I talked about the intervals and the ratios that make these intervals, and how, for example, the octave. So here's a middle C, and there's the octave above it. If I play them at the same time, they are so consonant, they blend so well together, that it's hard to hear them as two different tones at all. If I separate them, oh, now you can tell that I've got two different tones. But if I play them simultaneously, they blend so well, it's hard to tell the difference. And of course, this is the 2-to-1 ratio. Right. Another consonant interval is the perfect fifth. So like starting from C, if I count C as 1, this is another consonant interval. These tones blend well together, right? And by the way, and this again is a 2/3 ratio. Right. If I go from C down to G, we get what's called a perfect fourth, and this is also a consonant sound. Now, in practice, in tonal music, actually the perfect fourth was considered dissonant if it was a perfect fourth from the bass. Right? Because what we were used to is the sound of a third. Thirds are also consonant sounds. So octaves are consonant, fifths are consonant, fourths are consonant depending on the context. But what we really like are the sounds of thirds, right? And in fact, in the tonal harmonic system, our chords tend to be built on thirds. The interval of a third is like going 1, 2, 3 in the scale, right? Now, there are two different possibilities of thirds. There's the major third and the minor third. Minor third is also consonant. It just sounds a little sad compared to the major third, which sounds happy. There's nothing intrinsically happy or sad about these intervals. It's just that the way the composers have used them over time, we've developed these associations. Now, on the other hand, let's take this interval. This is a seventh. This is dissonant. Here's a interval of a second. That is a whole step, right? Another term for a whole step is a major second. You can hear these tones are clashing. Even more dissonant is a minor second or a half step. Minor second, half step, basically two terms for the same thing, right? There used to be a soap opera that had this theme. Dissonance tends to want to resolve to consonance. When we hear a dissonant sound, it creates tension and an expectation that eventually we will have a resolution to a consonant sound. So when dissonance is followed by consonance, we call this resolution. And in the logic of the tonal harmonic system, the logic that will underpin a chord progression, part of that logic is we want dissonance to resolve to consonance. Here's another famous dissonant interval, an interval that was considered diabolical in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and that is the interval of what's called a tritone. That is 3 whole tones from any given tone. If we go 3 whole tones up or 3 whole tones down, and we play these notes simultaneously, we get this interval, which you may have heard in that Simpsons theme. The bass is moving a tritone, and also the chord in the right hand is a tritone. And the melody right? That's a tritone. And the use of the tritone in that theme, I think it's deliberate, and it gives you the feeling that something is a little off about The Simpsons. There's something a little not quite right, a little wacky, a little... but be that as it may, the tritone is a dissonant interval, right? So we have this concept of consonance and dissonance, which is kind of based on the ratios. The more complex the ratio is, like a 7-to-6 ratio or a 9-to-8 ratio, the more dissonant it tends to be. The simpler the ratio is, like 2-to-1 or 2-to-3 or 3-to-4 or even 5-to-6, then the more consonant the note seems to be. Okay, moving on. The triad. Okay, so the triad is the simplest, most basic type of chord used in Western music. Triads, remember I said a little while ago that tonal harmony is based on, the chords in tonal harmony are based on the idea of stacking thirds, like a given note as the foundation of our chord, what we call the root, and then there will be some kind of a third stacked above it, either a major third or a minor third, and then if we stack another third up from that note, either a major third or a minor third, the result will be some kind of a triad. There are 4 different possible triads from any given note on the piano. 2 of them are more common than the other 2, but in no particular order, here they are. If I in fact, I'm going to start with the triad that is right there depicted on page 42 in the textbook, and that is a C major triad. If I take C and I decide, okay, I'm gonna build a chord on C, some kind of a triad, C is the root, right? It's the note that I'm going to build up from. If I go up a major third from C, that is 2 whole steps. Whole step, whole step. That's 4 half steps, 2 whole steps. I've got a major third. From the third, if I go up a minor third, that is 3 half steps, I get a major triad. Very common chord. Now, not only do I have a major third on the bottom and also a minor third on the top, I have a perfect fifth on the outside, right? All of my intervals are consonant. This interval is consonant, blends well together. These are consonant, they blend well together. And the perfect fifth on the outside also, these tones blend well together. So the chord is consonant, it is stable, right? Now, what if I, instead of having a major third and then a minor third stacked on top of each other, what if I did the opposite? What if I had a minor third and then a major third stacked on top of each other? This is a minor triad, and you can hear it sounds, it's like we went from happy to sad, like a cloud passed in front of the sun or something like that, right? Well, this chord is also consonant. We've got a minor third on the bottom, that's a consonant interval. Major third on the top, that's consonant, and the same perfect fifth on the outside, right? We can also think of this chord this way. If you take a major triad and you lower the middle note, the third, by a half step, you get a minor triad. These two are by far the most commonly used triads, but there are two others. What if I had two minor thirds stacked on top of each other? Okay, now this chord is tense and dissonant because I got a minor third on the bottom, that's consonant. I got a minor third on the top, that is also consonant, but the interval on the outside is that tritone. It's a diminished fifth, and that's what gives this chord this sort of tense quality. This is the chord that you hear, this is sort of like the cliffhanger chord. If you can imagine like an old silent movie where there's a girl tied to the railroad tracks, right? And the villain with his top hat and is twirling his mustache, waiting for the train to come around the bend. Will the hero arrive in time? Tune in next week. That's a diminished triad. It's a tense, unsettled type of chord. And what we expect when we hear this chord is that it will resolve to a consonant chord. We want this tension to resolve. All right. Finally, one chord left, and this is the rarest triad of them all, and that is the augmented triad. This is a very mysterious chord. It's basically just two major thirds stacked on top of each other. So if we take any given note, we'll take C, we go up 4 half steps, or 2 whole steps, we get our major third, and then from that note, up a major third, 4 half steps, or 2 whole steps. We get this chord. Now this chord is consonant actually because all of the intervals are actually consonant, but the problem is it's very unsettled somehow. It doesn't sound stable. It's like we're floating in space somehow. It feels sort of like not rooted, right? So this chord is consonant, and all of those chords I just played a random sequence of augmented triads, you know. And so the augmented triad is used less frequently than the other three, but it does have its uses. Right? Now, there are other types of chords that are possible. Those are just the most basic ones. Those are just the 4 different types of triads. We can continue this practice of stacking thirds, and we can get more and more complex chords. So, for example, if I take a major triad and I stack another third on top of it, I will have some kind of a 7th chord, because what I've got is a root, a third, a 5th, and a 7th, right? I could, now there are many different types of 7th chords. This one happens to be a major 7th chord. There's also such a thing as a major minor 7th chord, or a minor 7th chord, or one of my favorites, the diminished minor seventh chord, or the fully diminished seventh chord, very tense, unstable type of chord. We can continue this idea. We can have root, third, fifth, seventh, ninth. Right? And we could also maybe have an 11th. Now I'm going to have a sharp 11th, I think. Right? Now, as you hear those chords, you might think, oh, that's starting to sound sort of like jazz. And it is true that jazz uses 7th chords, 9th chords, 11th chords, 13th chords, also some other types of chords that I'm not really going to get into. This is one of the features of jazz, this huge vocabulary of chords. And in fact, you don't see a lot of triads used in jazz because they're considered kind of like too plain vanilla. They don't have enough flavor somehow. And in fact, this is an analogy I meant to make. You can think of dissonance, and if I start stacking, if I put a 7th on there, there's now additional dissonance, right? The major triad is consonant, but the major 7th chord is dissonant. But it's not an unpleasant kind of dissonance. It's only dissonant from the root to the 7th. But when we fill in the rest of the chord, it's dissonant but not unpleasant, not bad, not harsh. Same thing with this 9th chord. And depending on how we voice the chord, that is how we arrange the notes, we don't just have to have them all like stuck close to each other the way that I'm demonstrating them here. We could spread the notes out in some other way. We could have something like this. I could move the bass downward and kind of like space the notes out in different octaves to give it a little bit better sound. But once we get into 7th chords, 9th chords, 11th chords, 13th chords, then dissonance is inevitable. And what I was going to say is one way to think of dissonance is it's like seasoning, right? You might think, oh, consonants must be good because the sounds are blending well together, and dissonance must be bad. No, it's just that perhaps too much consonance is maybe kind of bland, at least to our modern ears. Too much dissonance, it's like putting too much seasoning on your food. You want to taste the food, but you also want a little bit of seasoning. If you dump too much on there, that's maybe at least one way to think of dissonance. If there's too much dissonance, and again, it's all like seasoning. It's a matter of taste. Some people like to have more dissonance. Some people don't. It's very particular. But that's one way that you might think of it. Dissonance is not bad. It is, however, at least in the Western common practice tonal harmonic style in this logical system of using certain chords and certain logical progressions, etc. Dissonance is considered unstable. And the idea is if you have instability, you want to introduce instability into your music to make it interesting, right? Just like if you're watching a movie, you want to have some places where you're not sure what's going to happen, where you're on the edge of your seat, where maybe even if it's sort of a drama, there's conflict between two characters or there's struggle. The main character has to go through some sort of a struggle. That's kind of like what dissonance is. It wouldn't be a very interesting movie or a very interesting novel if the main character just, had a pleasant, happy life the whole time and there was never any difficulty or conflict or tension that needed to be resolved. This is another thing. We want the resolution. We wouldn't want to go to a movie where we get to know this character and we like the character, we identify with the character, they go through struggles, and the struggles aren't resolved somehow. We have this somehow need. This is part of human storytelling. We have a need for a happy ending, a resolution of the tension that has been presented and has built up, right? Okay, so the book then talks about the tonic chord, the subdominant chord, the dominant chord. These are basically just the three most common chords in Western tonal music. The tonic is the keynote of whatever scale I'm in. If I'm in the key of C, then C is the tonic, right? That's another way of saying I'm in the key of C. C is the tonic. It is the tone that all other tones kind of revolve around and relate to. I can make any tone my tonal center, my tonic, but once I do, that note is the tonic. The dominant is the second most important tone because of its function of sort of pointing to the tonic and leading to the tonic. The dominant is scale degree 5. So if I'm in the key of C, here's my tonic. I count upwards. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? That's the dominant. Now, if I build a chord on the dominant, it's going to be a major chord. And within the key of C, that dominant chord tends to want to lead back to the tonic chord, right? Remember this little ditty that I composed the other day for you? Dominant, tonic. That dominant tonic cadence is all over the place. It ends. It's at the end. Now, it'll also be internally other places, but you find it at the end of 99% of tonal music. It's sort of like a framing device. It's a way of telling you you're at the end. Like, for example, in Happy Birthday, there are really only 3 chords. The dominant, the tonic, the dominant, and depending on how you choose to harmonize it, a 2 chord or a subdominant chord. But let me just play through it again to demonstrate the effect of the dominant going to the tonic. So first we start with the tonic. Tonic chord. Dominant chord. Dominant chord wants to go back to the tonic chord. Now here I'm going to use a 2 chord, although I could use a 4 chord, I guess. I don't like it as much. I prefer the 2 chord. Tonic chord, dominant chord, tonic. Sorry. I'm going to repeat this cadence so that you get that feeling of dominant to tonic. Once you're aware of it and you start listening to music, you're going to hear that dominant to tonic all over the place. The subdominant is, I guess, sort of like the third most important chord because it's called the subdominant because it's the chord or the tone which is below the dominant, subdominant. So here again is the tonic. There's the dominant. It's a perfect fifth up. The subdominant is just below it. And the chord built on the subdominant, if I'm in a major key, is also a major chord, right? So these 3 chords, the tonic, the subdominant, the dominant, back to the tonic. Anytime you have like a 3 chord song, 99% of the time, those 3 chords are the tonic, the subdominant, the dominant, and the tonic, right? Entire compositions, I mean, not super long compositions, but let's say like hymns, folk songs, pop songs, have been written just with those 3 chords. That's what the typical 3-chord song is. The 12-bar blues, by the way, uses only the tonic chord, the subdominant chord, and the dominant chord. Just those 3 chords, right? Now, there are many, many other chords. We can build a chord on any of the tones of a scale. And this is where I want to introduce a couple of terms that I'm not sure if the book gets into, but eventually I think they do introduce these terms somewhere. Diatonic and chromatic. Diatonic means using notes only within a given key or scale, right? So for example, in the key of C, the C major scale happens to be all the white keys on the piano, right? If I want to play a major scale from any other of the keys, I'm going to have at least a few, minimum 1 black keys in there. C major is the only major scale that has all white keys, which means In the key of C major, all the white keys happen to be diatonic. They are within the set. And all the black keys happen to be chromatic. They are outside of the set. The word chromatic, by the way, the chroma is the Greek word for color. So that means that if I'm in the key of C and I'm playing, let's say, my tonic and subdominant and dominant chords, and maybe some other chords, I'm playing all diatonic chords. You can't see, but right now I guarantee you I am playing only white keys, right? Listen to what happens. You'll be able to tell, even without being able to see the keyboard, you'll be able to tell when I introduce some black keys that are chromatic tones, tones that are outside of the scale, because they will introduce a certain color, okay? So I'm gonna play again this chord progression. So far it's strictly diatonic. Ooh, but how about that? That tone does not exist in the scale. Now I'm back to my dominant chord. These tones are all diatonic. How about this one? That tone doesn't exist in the scale. How about this one? That's diatonic. That's diatonic. It's my dominant chord. And back home. So I can introduce, even though I've decided I'm going to play something in the key of C major, I'm going to use the notes of the C major scale, I might choose to introduce tones from outside of the scale in order to add a certain color. All right. I also might choose to introduce tones from outside of the scale because I want to move to a different key center. Right? Remember how I said in explaining the concept of tonal music, how it's different from the older modal style. I said there's a possibility of moving from one key center to another, of having one tonic for a while and then saying, you know what, I want to move from the key of C to the key of D or to the key of G or whatever. So for example, here's a chord progression. I'm going to start out in the key of C, all diatonic, and now I'm going to move to the key of D minor. And then I had some diatonic chords in the key of D minor, but here I am in the key of D minor, right? How would I get from D minor back to C major? Let's see if I can do that. I'm in the key of D minor, and now I'm back in C major. This process of moving from one tonal center to another is called modulation. The process of moving from one key to another key is called modulation. Right? And in a composition, anything more than, let's say, a quote-unquote classical composition that is longer than, let's say, a few minutes, there are going to be some modulations in there. They might not last for very long. I might travel from C major to D minor and only hang out there for a little while and then head back to C major. Or in a longer composition, I might go to various different keys. And this is the way composers think of different keys. It's almost like they're navigating a chart. And they say, okay, I'm going to start out in C major. I'm going to go to A minor. And then from there, I'm going to go to E major. And they think of, and there are certain keys that are closer, tonally speaking, and certain keys that are more distant. And it doesn't even have to do with necessarily their distance on a keyboard. All right. So for example, the key of C major, its closest neighbors, tonally speaking, are the keys that correspond to the dominant and the subdominant. So here's the key of C major. I'm playing its 1, 4, and 5 chords basically. Here's the key of G major, same sequence of chords. Right? And these chords have a lot of tones in common because the key of C has no sharps, one flat, no sharps, no flats. The key of G has only one sharp, F sharp. That means that the key of C and the key of G have almost all notes in common. The only note they don't have in common is this one. Let me play those again for you. Here's a C major scale. Here is a G major scale. G is the dominant of C. The only note they don't have in common is that F sharp. C has an F natural in its scale, but G has an F sharp in its scale. Because they have so many tones in common, even though they are not close to each other on the keyboard, they are close to each other in the tonal universe. They're like next door neighbors. However, the key that is right next door to C major on either side, let's say B major and D flat major, those are very distant keys because they don't have a lot of tones in common. Here's a chord progression in C major again. Remember how I did this with C major and then I did it with G major to demonstrate how closely related they are. If I do the same thing with C major and then with B major, you can hear that, whoa, we're like in a different place now. We don't have hardly any tones in common, right? Let's go back to C major. And now I'm going to go up to the closest tone up, which is D flat. Only 2 tones in common, right? 5 tones are different in those scales. Only 2 are common. So just because 2 keys, like piano keys, are close to each other on the keyboard doesn't mean that they are close to each other in this tonal universe, right? So composers kind of navigate this tonal universe, and they sometimes choose to go to closely related keys. Sometimes they choose to go directly to distant keys, and it has this effect of like going through like in a science fiction movie, of going through a wormhole or some kind of a portal, right? So for example, again, I'm going to start out in C major, and I'm going to go to a closely related key. I'm going to go to the key of G. And this is like making a journey from my house, like walking around in the rooms of my house, the diatonic chords, and then stepping over to my next door neighbor's house and walking around in his house. Not a big deal, not a very dramatic journey. Now I'm going to go to a fairly distant key. I'm going to go from C major to, let's see, to B major. Now you can hear that was an unexpected, kind of a weird journey there, right? I mean, it sort of logically made sense. I tried to make it make sense with my chord progression, but there's no denying it. It took a weird turn there. That's because C major and B major have only 2 notes in common. Instead of having 7 notes in common, like C and G, they only have 2 notes in common. So it's like a sudden, unexpected journey to, like across the world, across the tonal world to a very unexpected place. So different modulations have different sort of psychological effects on the listener, and composers are very aware of this, and they sort of like plot a course from one key to another if they're in a large composition, and they're trying to get this effect on the listener of being in different places. That's how they think. Keys are like different tonal regions, different geographical regions within this tonal system. I've talked about some of these things on page 44 and 45, the idea of key, of being in a key. The major scale and the minor scale are our 2 most common scales in the tonal harmonic system. The minor scale actually has 3 slightly different forms, which we don't really need to get into. But here's a C major scale. Here's a C natural minor scale. All right. There's also a form of minor called harmonic minor and melodic minor, but we don't really need to worry about that too much since this isn't a music theory class. Moving on, again, just sort of like working off of the book just as a frame of reference. We've talked about the possibility of major and minor keys, right? Here's some chords in C major. Here's some chords in C minor. I'm changing mode now. Suddenly sounds kind of gloomy, right? So we need to have a key signature. Remember in my talk on music notation, I talked about the key signature, which a composer puts at the beginning of the piece to let you know which notes are sharp or flat, and therefore what key you are in. And here the book mentions something called the chromatic scale. Now I've already given you the term chromatic. It means color. It means notes that are outside of a given scale. And the opposite is diatonic. All of the notes that are within a given scale are considered diatonic. There is something called the chromatic scale, which I kind of wish they hadn't introduced here. I wish they had rather talked about chromatic versus diatonic. Instead, they talk about the chromatic scale. This is kind of a different use of the word chromatic, right? There is such a thing as the chromatic scale, and it is simply a scale made up completely of half steps. Whereas the major scale, for example, is a pattern or a formula of certain whole and half steps. From any given starting note to form a major scale, you go up a whole step, another whole step, a half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. So it's like starting note, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And if you were, again, one of my music theory students, you'd have to memorize that. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. That's what gives you a major scale. I could pick any note at random, and as long as I do that pattern, starting note, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, I wind up with a major scale. The chromatic scale is all half steps, so it sounds like this. And what happens when you listen to this after a while, you don't have any sense of a tonal center. You don't feel like I'm in the key of whatever. The chromatic scale has no key because all of its intervals are half steps. Every note is more or less equidistant from any other note, and you sort of lose your frame of reference, right? The same effect on the guitar, by the way, the chromatic scale on the guitar. If I just start any place, and maybe I'll start on an E open string, and I just go from one fret to the next. There's probably a better way of doing this, but I'm not a guitar player. If I keep this up, you lose sort of like the memory of what note you started at, and that there is no tonic. There is no one note that is more important, that is like the center of gravity, the way there is in a major scale. If I play a major scale, you have this strong sense of what the tonic is, even if I don't necessarily play the notes of the scale that way. Even if I'm playing one of my chord progressions, you retain a sense of the center of gravity. Chromatic scale has no center of gravity, and therefore it's not really that useful as a scale. The way composers use it is sort of like a sound effect, basically, or as filler. And this is another one of the reasons I kind of wish they hadn't bothered introducing it. The chromatic scale is a scale made up of half steps. Because it's made up of half steps, it's not really all that useful in tonal music because it has no tonal center. It's used as sort of filler or as sort of a sound effect, and it's not really used in a structural way. It's used more in a decorative way or as an embellishment. I've talked about modulation, change of key. We could start out in one key, travel to other keys. That's what modulation is. The next couple pages talk about musical texture. I've already talked about musical texture in a previous lecture because it has to do with melody, not really with harmony. Right? There are three textures: monophonic, when you have one melody and nothing else; homophonic, when you have melody plus accompaniment, by far the most common texture; polyphonic, the most difficult, the most complex and challenging texture. This is when you have multiple melodies going on simultaneously. So that gets us through the unit on harmony. There's so much more to say about harmony. You could study harmony your whole life, and it would still be fascinating and mysterious, but we've only got one lecture to do that. So next time we'll move on to talking about form and style, and maybe a little bit about the different eras of music that we will study in forthcoming lectures. So we'll see you then.